What? I can't believe you kids don't know about the great patriot Ollie North.
With others, it's just that I don't recall.
They did was technically high treason.
First, let me say I take full responsibility for my own actions and for the...
Reagan went around the sissy Congress, Ollie North.
I don't recall.
Power is not a means, it is an end. George Orwell, 1984. What's crazy to me is the American founding fathers were aware of this danger of power centuries before Orwell put it into words. They put safeguards in place in their brand new nation, spreading out the power across 3 different branches, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. They even put a 4th safeguard in, making their country a democracy. But these safeguards don't prevent problems. And a perfect example of these problems, of this addiction to power, the abuse, and the conflict, is in the Iran-Contra affair. It's always difficult to know where to begin these stories. Our story will begin at the end the 1980 US presidential election. Incumbent Democratic President Jimmy Carter has 2 election-defeating problems. The first is a stagnant economy with high inflation, and the second is the 52 American hostages he was failing to rescue from Iran. Former governor of Texas and former Republican presidential candidate John Connally heads to the Middle East. He lets the Iranians know that if they wait till Ronald Reagan takes office, the Republicans will give them a better deal. And the Iranians do wait until the day Reagan takes office to release the hostages.
Thank you.
So what was this better deal that the Iranians were after? See, all of Iran's weapons came from America prior to their 1979 revolution. But as part of the hostage crisis, President Jimmy Carter put an arms embargo on Iran. For Reagan's part, he realized that the Iranians could buy more American weapons from America's allies, or worse yet, buy weapons from the Soviet Union and fall into the Soviet sphere of influence. So Reagan did 2 things. First, he launched Operation Staunch, an operation to make sure that nobody sold Iran any weapons. And the second was to allow Israel to sell American weapons to Iran. What did Israel get out of this? Israel wanted Iran and Iraq, 2 potential enemies, distracted fighting each other instead of fighting Israel. So while the whole Iran thing was going on, Reagan was throwing himself into another conflict in Central America. He found the Honduras-based right-wing rebels, the Contras, the moral equivalent of the Founding Fathers. They were fighting the left-wing Sandinista government of Nicaragua. Unfortunately for Republican President Ronald Reagan, Congress switched to Democratic control thanks to the 1982 midterms. They didn't agree with Reagan. They didn't find the Contras heroes. They sold drugs and abused human rights. So Congress looked to exert some control over the executive branch. They signed 3 amendments, Bolton amendments. The first said that Reagan couldn't help the Contras overthrow the Nicaraguan government. The second said no intelligence or defense agencies can help the Contras. And the third finally banned all funding towards the Contras. Despite the amendments, Ronald Reagan still looks to exert his influence in Central America. He tells the National Security Council to keep the Contras alive, body and soul, no matter what Congress says. So the NSC does what they can. They create a company called the Enterprise and get a man called Richard Secord to head it. Although the NSC ran the Enterprise, there was now some plausible deniability. In 1985, things started to change. National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane retired to be replaced by John Poindexter, real name. A new plan came out. They would keep selling weapons to Iran, but they would switch which Iranian they were actually selling to, and now they would require Iran to tell the terrorist group they were supporting, Hezbollah, to release the American hostages they were holding. This plan fell through, though, as the arms dealer between Israel and Iran, Gorbanov, refused to ask the Iranians to release any hostages. The weapons kept flowing, though. It's also important to note that Secretary of State George Shultz and Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger hated this plan, but Reagan held enough influence in the executive branch to make the plan go through anyway. Enter Oliver North, John Poindexter's deputy colonel. He changed the plan once again. Now, instead of selling weapons through Israel, America would sell Iran weapons directly, at an increased cost. This increased profit would then go to the Contras. Allegedly, Poindexter approved the plan without telling Reagan. Side note, Gorbanov also increased the price when they were selling to the Iranians, but that was just to increase his own profits. The public became aware of this scandal first thanks to a Lebanese newspaper. The first report was of a downed CIA plane. The pilot had been captured by the Sandinista government, and this is when American public became aware of the weapons for hostage trade. Ronald Reagan immediately jumped on national television and denied all charges and launched the Tower Commission. Public perception matters in a democracy, and Reagan's trying to keep on top of his perception. He starts an independent council headed by Lawrence Walsh, and he appears himself before the Tower Commission, although he gave the Tower Commission no teeth and a tight deadline. The Tower Commission gave its report 3 months after being formed. It had no power of subpoena, could not force testimony, and it couldn't grant immunity to prosecution. Despite its flaws, once the Tower Commission released its report, Reagan jumped on primetime address to tell the public what it found.
The truth, and as frustrating as the waiting has been, I felt it was improper.
It found that Oliver North and John Poindexter had taken the National Security Council and Advisory Board and made it operational illegally. It found that William Casey, head of the CIA, who knew of the plan and approved of it, should have taken over the operation and informed Reagan and Congress as legally required. It also held Reagan accountable for not having full control of his staff. In January of 1987, while the Tower Commission was still investigating, Congress looked to claw back some of its power from the executive branch. It launched an inquiry of its own. However, they did not want to go after Reagan. They thought Reagan was old, his mental acuity was in question, he had little time left in office, and there was a belief that the public did not want another Watergate. Congress released a majority report. It found the operationalized National Security Council used private business and third parties to circumvent U.S. law. A minority report, signed only by Republicans, blamed Democrats for vaguely worded changing laws that interfered with the executive branch's ability to conduct its prerogative of foreign affairs. Henry Hyde, a minority signer, wrote that this was really a conflict of rights and duties, and choices that are evil and less evil. The minority report sounds to me like a bunch of whiny Republicans complaining about the clawbacks of their executive power. Not to be outdone by the congressional inquiry, the judicial inquiry, looking to also keep the executive branch in check, led by independent counsel Lauren Walsh, indicted many people, too many to list. But for our story, the important parts are Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberg for perjury and destruction of justice, Robert McFarland, former National Security Advisor, for withholding evidence, Oliver North, Deputy National Security Advisor, of obstruction of congressional inquiry and destruction of documents. He destroyed those documents in November, before December, when the first inquiry at the Tower Commission even started. John Poindexter, National Security Advisor, for obstruction of justice, perjury, and a destruction of evidence. Richard Secord, former Air Force officer and arms dealer, pled guilty to making false statements to Congress. In a bizarre move, Walsh got Weinberg indicted on another false statement a week before a presidential election. This time, the presidential election was for former Vice President to Reagan, now President, George H.W. Bush. This indictment might have cost George H.W. Bush his re-election chances. President George H.W. Bush may have lost his election, but he still holds executive branch powers until he leaves office. He pardoned 6 of the Iran-Contra conspirators, leading Walsh to say, "The Iran-Contra cover-up, which has continued for 6 years, has now been completed." I mean, these guys abused power, and then used the power of the executive branch to pardon themselves. I also want to talk about Reagan and his culpability here. I mean, he was found not directly responsible by the 3 commissions, but we can't say that for certain, because for certain the congressional inquiry didn't really look into him. For certain people lied to the inquiry, and for certain documents were destroyed, so I don't know what we can really say other than I think the winner of this struggle is the executive branch.
Thank you.
Democracy didn't hold them in check, the congressional powers didn't hold them in check, and the judicial branch didn't hold them in check, because everybody just got pardoned after. Who knows? Maybe I'm just crazy.